Okay, so something that we often hear about in the area of sexual brokenness is sexual trauma. And this is something that sadly is a common experience for men and women. It's not just something, I think for me growing up, a lot of it was you would assume that women are sexually abused. And I would say that the higher percentage is in that area, but at the same time, this is something a lot of people experience. And I it could be someone's curiosity as a kid. It could be so many different situations, but we want to talk about it specifically. And this was actually something that we had a listener send in, hey, could we talk about this topic? And so it's going to be a good conversation and maybe a heavy conversation, but the hope is to really to talk about how it affects our lives and really how to find healing from it. So first thing, this is obviously just a terrible experience for so many people to have experienced sexual trauma, whether you know the person or not in relationship. Is sexual trauma just rape and abuse, or can it be more than rape or abuse?
It can definitely be more. We were just talking about this, that if you look at the definition of sexual trauma, it's deeply distressing or disturbing experience. And so from even just talking to people, some people on their wedding night, if they waited until their wedding night to have sex, that was traumatic for them. It was deeply distressing, it was disturbing, and they have to process through why. And so it's not just the boogeyman that comes out and kidnaps somebody and rapes him, but it could be in a marriage, it could be just sexual curiosity, like you were saying, early exposure, it could be being teased about your body. So many things can impact how we experience sexual health and what constitutes as a trauma.
Yeah.
So you had mentioned that this is something that happens for or to both women and men, and in just recent data, it's about 1 in 4 women who, before they're an adult, that they will have experienced some form of sexual trauma or abuse.
That's insane.
Well, it is insane.
But you don't think about that number very
crazy,
often.
yeah.
It's
Right.
crazy how often.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing to keep in mind, in men, it's about 1 in 13, but is that sexual abuse is one of the least reported things.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so there's a lot of people who, because usually you're abused by somebody you know or a family member or something, that they don't ever say anything to anybody. And so even with that, think about those numbers as being lower than really what is reported. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and I think what you're getting at the question is to help us make sure we broaden the definition of sexual trauma, because it does tend to be an area that can go overlooked. You know, the church especially has been so focused on, helping men with pornography or addiction, that we forget that all those men that are married are creating some sort of sexual trauma in their relationships with their wives. And so if you've been married to an addict or someone dealing deeply with this issue, there's some level of trauma in your life. And so it's just helping us recognize we've got to take that very, very seriously, to recognize healing will need to happen on both sides, not just one or the other. And that broadly speaking, just like we talk about how when a struggler or an addict comes into our office, and our counseling team will say they've never met with someone who overemphasizes their trauma, who is overestimating, that blows it out of proportion. It's our human nature, it's our brain setting to kind of protect ourselves and underestimate or kind of downplay it just so we can feel okay and live with ourselves. Well, if that's happening in trauma in general, I think we should expect that the same thing happens in sexual trauma, that we tend to say, well, just, all men struggle, or that's just what happened, or we figured it out and moved on. We really need the ability to stop and say, how has this impacted my worldview? How has it impacted how I see myself and relationships? Yeah. Because if that trauma doesn't get addressed, healing is going to be very difficult to come by, both individually and in the relationship.
Yeah, and I think too that we see this a lot, especially in this area of healing, that people they compare trauma, like, oh, my parents didn't get divorced or I wasn't abused, therefore I, like you and me personally, our trauma story is very different. It looks completely different. And from the outside looking in, you might think my trauma, I actually don't have trauma compared to you. Yeah. And the same thing is true in this area of sexual trauma, where we start to minimize it. And then, as you're saying, that keeps us stuck in maybe behavior or ways of thinking that keep us stuck in a lifestyle or decisions that we don't want to continue making.
Yeah. Well, we hear the woman is like, well, my husband didn't have affairs, so I shouldn't be that worried about. And really, you hear in their language, they're comparing.
Totally.
you really can't do that, because you have to take seriously what has happened in your life and the impact it's had on you, whether from childhood or as an adult in your relationship.
Yep.